Uncle James put his hand on my shoulder and asked loud enough for everyone to hear, "How is life in that $2 million house you purchased, Jasmine?" The jazz music seemed to stop instantly. My sister Tiana froze, her hands still raised to show off her ring. My parents, Marcus and Vanessa, looked like they had seen a ghost. My father hissed, "James, what house are you talking about?" I took a slow sip of my Pinot Noir and smiled. That was the moment the check finally came due for 30 years of lies. Before I tell you how I evicted my own parents, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. My name is Jasmine. I am 32 years old, and I make my living finding hidden assets for Fortune 500 companies. I am a forensic accountant. In my world, everything leaves a paper trail. You can lie to your spouse, you can lie to the IRS, but you cannot lie to the math. Yet for my entire life, my family tried to convince me that up was down. I was the black sheep, the stingy one, the ungrateful daughter. Meanwhile, my younger sister Tiana was the golden child. She was the one with the lighter skin, the brighter smile, and the absolute refusal to work for anything she wanted. Sitting here in my penthouse on Lakeshore Drive looking out at the Chicago city lights, it is hard to believe that just 48 hours ago, I was the family outcast. Let me take you back to last Saturday, the engagement party. My parents had rented a massive white tent for the backyard of the house I grew up in. It was a beautiful home, or at least it looked that way on the surface. My mother had spent weeks nagging me to contribute $5,000 for the catering. When I refused, she told me I was jealous of my sister finding love. I went anyway, wearing a simple dress prepared to be ignored. The air was thick with expensive perfume and desperation. Tiana was holding court near the Champagne Tower. She was marrying Liam, a man from a wealthy New England family, or so my parents thought. "Look at it, sparkle!" Tiana shrieked, shoving her hand into her best friend's face. "Liam went to a private jeweler in Antwerp for this. It is a VVS1 Clarity diamond." My mother was beaming, clutching her glass of champagne. "That is my girl," she announced to the room. "She was born for this lifestyle, not like some of us who are content with being ordinary." Her eyes flicked to me sitting alone at the corner table. I sat there cutting my chicken, analyzing the refraction of light on Tiana's finger. I did not need a loupe to see the double refraction. It was a high-quality synthetic stone, probably purchased online for a few $100s. But the lie was not just about the ring. It was about everything. The car in the driveway, the food on the plates, and the smile on my mother's face. They were celebrating the fantasy funded by debt, and they had no idea that I was the one holding the ledger. My mother, Vanessa, is a woman who could sell ice to a polar bear and convince him it was a luxury item. When Uncle James dropped his bombshell about the $2 million house, the silence that followed was heavy enough to crush a lesser woman. But not Vanessa. She did not flinch. She did not stammer. She simply threw her head back and let out a light, tinkling laugh that sounded like wind chimes in a storm. "Oh, James, you are always so dramatic," she said, waving her manicured hand dismissively, as if he had just made a bad pun. "That isn't Jasmine's house, silly. That is just a little investment property Marcus and I picked up for the family trust. We just put it in Jasmine's name for tax purposes. You know how it is with capital gains and shell companies." She used the financial terms loosely and incorrectly, but with enough confidence that nobody questioned her. Then she turned to Liam and placed a hand on his arm, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "We were actually going to save this for the wedding toast, but since the secret is out, yes, that penthouse is part of Tiana's dowry." I opened my mouth to speak, to scream, to flip the table over, but before a sound could escape my throat, I felt a sharp, agonizing pain in my foot. My father had stomped on my toes with the heel of his dress shoe under the table. I looked up and saw his eyes boring into mine. They were not the eyes of a loving father. They were the eyes of a man held hostage by his own lies. His lips were pressed into a thin line and he gave his head a microscopic shake. Immediacy radiated from him. Do not speak. Do not ruin this. I froze, the pain throbbing in my foot, matching the pounding in my temples. I looked across at Liam, expecting him to see through the charade. Instead, I saw a transformation. The suspicion that had clouded his face vanished, replaced by a look of predatory delight. He looked at Tiana as if she had just turned into a winning lottery ticket. "Oh, I see," Liam said, leaning back in his chair and smoothing his silk tie. "That makes perfect sense. I did wonder how a forensic accountant could afford a place on Lakeshore Drive. No offense, Jasmine." He chuckled and the table laughed with him. A polite, condescending ripple of laughter that stripped me of my dignity. In that moment, I was no longer the owner of a luxury property. I was just the placeholder, the straw man, the obedient daughter holding the assets until the real princess was ready to claim them. Tiana beamed, preening under the attention. She did not even look at me. She just squeezed Liam's hand and whispered loud enough for me to hear, "I told you my parents were generous." She believed it. She truly believed that she was entitled to the fruits of my labor simply because she existed. The audacity was so thick I could taste it like bile. My mother stood up then, clapping her hands together. "Jasmine, darling, come help me with the dessert inside." Her voice was sweet, like poisoned honey. But as she passed my chair, her fingers dug into my shoulder with bruising force. It was not an invitation. It was a summons to court. The kitchen door swung shut behind us, cutting off the jazz music and the polite chatter of the garden party. The sudden silence was heavy and suffocating. My mother Vanessa released my arm with a shove that sent me stumbling slightly against the cold granite island. She did not ask if I was okay. She did not apologize for stomping on my foot or for lying to an entire crowd of wealthy guests. Instead, she turned on me with eyes blazing like a cornered animal. Her chest was heaving beneath her silk dress, and for a moment I thought she might actually strike me. "How could you?" she hissed, her voice low and venomous. "How could you sit there and let your uncle humiliate us like that? You know how important today is for Tiana. You know how hard we have worked to secure a match with a family like the Kensingtons." I leaned back against the counter, crossing my arms to create a physical barrier between us. The kitchen was filled with trays of untouched hors d'oeuvres that cost more than my first car, but the air smelled of rot. I looked my mother in the eye and kept my voice dangerously calm. "I was not the one who lied," I said. "I was not the one who promised my sister a $2 million property that does not belong to me. That is my name on the deed, Mother. My money, my mortgage, my sweat." My mother laughed, a harsh, humorless sound that echoed off the stainless steel appliances. She looked at me with a mixture of pity and disgust, as if I were a child who did not understand how the real world worked. "Belong to you," she mocked, stepping closer until I could smell the expensive champagne on her breath. "Everything you have belongs to this family, Jasmine. We raised you, we fed you, we put a roof over your head for 18 years. We sacrificed our own comfort so you could go to that fancy university. And now, when your sister finally has a chance at real happiness, you want to hoard everything for yourself like a miser. You are selfish, Jasmine. You have always been cold and selfish, just like your uncle." She reached into her clutch and pulled out her phone, checking the time as if she were scheduling a hair appointment instead of ordering grand larceny. "Here is what is going to happen," she said, her tone shifting from angry to commanding. She smoothed the front of her dress, regaining her composure. "Tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock, you are going to meet us at the family lawyer's office. You are going to sign a quitclaim deed transferring the penthouse to Tiana. We will tell Liam and his parents that it was a surprise gift from her loving sister. You will smile, you will sign, and you will fix this mess." I stared at her, unable to comprehend the sheer entitlement. "You want me to give her my home?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "The home I worked 80-hour weeks to pay for." My mother rolled her eyes. "Oh, stop being so dramatic. You make plenty of money with that boring accounting job of yours. You can buy another one. Tiana needs this. She needs the status to keep a man like Liam. You are the big sister, Jasmine. You owe your sister this happiness. It is the least you can do after all we have done for you. Do not make me ask you twice." The kitchen door swung open before I could respond to my mother's threat. Tiana breezed in, bringing a cloud of floral perfume and entitlement with her. She did not even look at the tension in the room. She walked straight to the refrigerator, grabbed a bottle of premium water, and hopped onto the counter, swinging her legs like a teenager. "So when do I get the keys?" she asked, scrolling through her phone without looking up. "I found this amazing interior designer in the city who specializes in modern penthouses. I need to get her in there by Monday to measure for drapes. Liam says the current lighting is probably too harsh, so we are going to gut the living room first." She spoke about my home, my sanctuary, as if it were a dollhouse she had just unwrapped on Christmas morning. I looked at my mother, expecting her to rein her daughter in, but Vanessa just crossed her arms and nodded encouragingly. "Go ahead, Jasmine. Give your sister the details," she said. I turned to Tiana and spoke clearly. "You are not bringing a designer into my house, Tiana. You are not gutting my living room. And you are certainly not getting a key." Tiana stopped scrolling. She looked up slowly, her expression shifting from boredom to confusion. "Excuse me?" She laughed, a short, sharp sound. "What are you talking about? Mom just said it is my dowry." "You do not need 5 bedrooms, Jasmine. You are single. You are 32 and the only thing you sleep with is your laptop. What are you going to do, fill the guest rooms with cats?" She hopped off the counter and walked toward me, invading my personal space. "Liam is a Kensington," she hissed, poking a manicured finger into my chest. "He is used to a certain standard of living. He is white, Jasmine. He comes from old money. He cannot live in some cramped apartment. I secured a high-value man for this family. I did my job. Now do yours and hand over the asset. You are just the bank account. I am the face. That is how it works." The sheer disrespect made my blood boil, but I kept my voice steady. "Being a trophy wife is not a job, Tiana, it is a dependency. And my house is not your severance package. Get out of my face." Tiana turned purple. She had never been told no in her entire life. She grabbed a crystal wine glass from the drying rack next to her. "You are just jealous," she screamed. "You are a bitter, lonely old maid who cannot stand that I am happy." She hurled the glass at the floor right between my feet. It shattered instantly, sending shards of crystal flying across the kitchen tiles. My mother gasped, but she did not scold Tiana. She looked at me with disappointment. "Look what you made her do," Vanessa said. "Just fix this, Jasmine, before you ruin everything." Tiana stormed out, sobbing fake tears, leaving me standing in the wreckage of my own kitchen. I looked down at the broken glass and realized something important. They would never stop taking until I forced them to stop. The night air in the garden should have felt refreshing after the toxic atmosphere of the kitchen, but with my father standing there blocking my path, it felt suffocating. Marcus did not look like the jovial host who had been toasting champagne 30 minutes ago. Under the dim string lights, his face was hard and his eyes were cold. He did not ask me if I was okay. He did not ask about the broken glass or his hysterical younger daughter. He simply pointed a finger at my chest, his voice low and trembling with suppressed rage. "You are enjoying this, aren't you, Jasmine? You are enjoying holding this over our heads. You think because you have a little money now that you are better than us. You think you can dictate terms to the man who put clothes on your back." I tried to step around him, but he moved to block me again. "I am not trying to dictate anything, Dad," I said, my voice tired. "I just want to go home to my house, the one I bought." My father laughed, a bitter sound that made my stomach turn. He stepped closer, invading my personal space until I could smell the stale scotch on his breath. "Let me tell you something about the real world, Jasmine. Nobody cares about your hard work. They care about image. They care about lineage. Do you know what I told Liam's father tonight? I told him we are partners. I told him that I own half the commercial real estate on the south side and that you manage the books. I built a legend for this family. And now you want to tear it down because of what? Pride, greed." I stared at him, stunned by the confession. "You lied to them," I whispered. "You built this entire marriage on a fraud." My father's face turned red. "It is not fraud, it is marketing." Tiana deserves this life. She deserves to be a Kensington. And I deserve to be the father of a Kensington. I spent 30 years working a middle management job at a bank while watching less talented men get promoted over me. Now it is my turn to shine. It is my turn to sit at the high table. And I will not let my ungrateful daughter ruin my moment in the sun because she is too stingy to share. He grabbed my shoulders, his fingers digging into my skin. Listen to me clearly. You are going to sign that house over to your sister tomorrow. You are going to apologize to Tiana and you are going to play the part of the doting sister. If you do not, if you say one word to Liam or his parents that contradicts my story, you are done. I will disown you, Jasmine. You will not be welcome at Christmas. You will not be welcome at funerals. You will be dead to us. I looked at the man who raised me, the man who taught me to ride a bike, and I realized he was gone. In his place was a desperate small man terrified of being exposed. I pulled away from his grip and straightened my dress. Do what you have to do, Marcus, I said, using his first name for the first time. But remember this, when you disown the only person in the family who actually has money, you are not hurting me. You are bankrupting yourself. I walked past him, leaving him standing in the shadows of his own lies. I walked back into the white tent, with my father's threats still ringing in my ears. The party was in full swing now, with waiters circulating trays of champagne and guests laughing under the soft glow of the string lights. To anyone else, it looked like a perfect celebration of love. To me, it looked like a crime scene where the robbery was currently in progress. I tried to slip back to my seat unnoticed, but Mrs. Kensington Liam's mother spotted me immediately. She was a woman who wore her wealth like armor. Her pearls were real, her Chanel suit was vintage, and her smile never quite reached her cold gray eyes. She patted the empty chair next to her with a gesture that was less of an invitation and more of a command. Jasmine, dear, she said, her voice smooth and cultivated. Do sit down. We have barely had a chance to chat. I sat down, bracing myself for another round of condescension. Usually, Mrs. Kensington ignored me completely, preferring to fawn over Tiana's lighter complexion and more malleable personality. But tonight, I was the flavor of the month. She leaned in close, the scent of expensive lilies wafting from her perfume. Your mother was just telling me about the property on Lakeshore Drive, she said, lowering her voice to a confidential whisper. It sounds simply divine. Which building is it exactly? I told her the address, keeping my face neutral. Her eyebrows shot up. Oh my. That is the pre-war building with the limestone facade, isn't it? The one with the private elevator access. I nodded. She hummed in approval, her eyes taking on a sharp, calculating gleam. And the property taxes, she continued, taking a delicate sip of her drink. I know Cook County can be absolutely murder on assessments for properties over 2,000 square feet. Have you appealed the latest assessment, or are you paying the full rate? I stared at her. This was not small talk. This was due diligence. These were the kind of questions an investor asks before acquiring a distressed asset. Why would a woman from old money care about property tax rates unless she was worried about paying them? The realization hit me like a splash of cold water. She was not just making conversation, she was auditing the dowry. It is fully paid off, isn't it? Mrs. Kensington asked, pressing a little harder when I did not answer immediately. No mortgage, no liens, just a clean title ready for transfer. I looked at this woman who had spent the last year making subtle digs about my hair and my career, and I saw her for what she really was. She was broke, or at least cash poor. People with real liquidity do not ask about HOA fees at an engagement party. They hire people to do that for them. I forced a smile that felt tight on my face. The title is clean, Mrs. Kensington, I said, emphasizing the word title. But taxes are always a burden, aren't they? Especially if one is not prepared for the upkeep. She narrowed her eyes slightly, sensing the challenge in my tone, but before she could respond, Liam appeared at her shoulder. He placed a hand on his mother's chair, but his eyes were locked on me. And in that moment, I realized I was surrounded by sharks. The only difference was that some were wearing silk suits and others were wearing pearls. I needed something stronger than the watered-down punch, so I made my way to the open bar at the edge of the tent. I was hoping for 5 minutes of solitude to check my blood pressure, but peace is a luxury I cannot afford in this family. Before I could order a whiskey neat, Liam materialized next to me. He moved with the smooth confidence of a man who has never been told no, but up close the cracks in the veneer were visible. There was a sheen of sweat on his forehead despite the cool evening air, and his smile did not quite reach his eyes. He signaled the bartender for a scotch and leaned his elbow on the bar, encroaching on my personal space. "Great party, Jasmine," he said, his voice low and intimate. "Your parents really went all out." I nodded, taking a sip of my drink. "They certainly know how to put on a show, Liam. I hope you are enjoying the performance." He chuckled, but the sound was dry. He swirled the amber liquid in his glass, watching the ice melt. "Look, I wanted to ask you about the property. The penthouse. Your mother mentioned it is fully paid off, but I wanted to hear it from you. You know how parents can be with details. I just want to make sure everything is clean for Tiana. I would hate for us to start our marriage dealing with someone else's hidden debt or liens. I mean, we have a certain image to maintain, and financial entanglements can be so messy." He looked at me, expecting reassurance, expecting me to be the dutiful sister who would apologize for being a potential burden. The audacity was breathtaking. Here was a man who had brought nothing to the table but a last name and a suit, asking if my $2 million asset was good enough for him to steal. I turned to face him fully, letting the silence stretch just long enough to make him uncomfortable. He was not asking out of concern for Tiana. He was asking because he was already calculating how much equity he could borrow against. He saw my home as his personal ATM. I looked him up and down, letting my gaze linger on his expensive watch, which I strongly suspected was a high-end replica, just like Tiana's ring. "You do not have to worry about my finances, Liam," I said, my voice cool and professional. "My assets are impeccable. I keep everything strictly above board. No hidden debts, no gambling losses, and certainly no tax evasion." I leaned in closer, matching his energy. "I like my titles clean, Liam, just like I like my background checks. Can you say the same about your financial history?" The color drained from his face instantly. The scotch glass paused halfway to his mouth. For the first time all night, the arrogant smile vanished, and I saw genuine fear in his eyes. He realized too late that he was not talking to a passive sister-in-law. He was talking to a forensic accountant who had just marked him as a person of interest. My parents acted like we were entering the pearly gates when we pulled up to the Kensington Country Club. The valet opened the door to my father's leased Mercedes, and my mother stepped out, adjusting her fascinator hat as if she were attending the Royal Ascot instead of a Tuesday brunch. The air smelled of freshly cut grass and exclusion. I could feel the eyes of the members on us, a heavy, silent judgment that weighed more than humidity. My father Marcus kept tugging at his cuffs, trying to look like a man who spent his weekends on the back nine, rather than a man who was 3 months behind on his car payments. Tiana, of course, was in her element. She floated toward the clubhouse in a pastel dress she could not afford, looking every inch the trophy wife in training. We found Liam and his parents on the terrace overlooking the 18th hole. Mrs. Kensington rose to greet us, holding a martini glass that looked like an extension of her hand. She bypassed my parents and went straight for Tiana, taking my sister's face in her hands like she was inspecting a prize-winning show dog. "You look absolutely ravishing, my dear," she cooed, loud enough for her friends at the next table to hear. "Such delicate features. You know, I was telling Charles just this morning how fortunate we are. Tiana has such a universal look, so exotic, almost European in the right light." It was a compliment wrapped in poison, a classic microaggression designed to praise Tiana's proximity to whiteness while erasing her heritage. Tiana just giggled, soaking it up like rain in a drought. Then Mrs. Kensington turned to me. Her smile didn't vanish, but it became tight and brittle like dry leaves. "And this must be the accountant's sister," she said, her tone dropping several degrees. "Jasmine, isn't it? You certainly look different from Tiana. You have very strong features, don't you? Very urban." She let the word hang in the air, a polite slur that made my skin crawl. She was telling me I was too dark, too bold, too undeniably black for her country club aesthetic. I stared right back at her, refusing to lower my eyes. "I take after my grandfather. Mrs. Kensington," I said, my voice steady. "He was a man who built things with his own hands. He taught me that strength is a virtue, not a flaw." My mother, Vanessa, practically threw herself between us, terrified that I would offend the woman holding the purse strings. "Oh yes, Tiana takes after my grandmother's side," she said, laughing nervously, her voice pitching up an octave. "We have some French Creole ancestry way back, very refined. But Jasmine, well, Jasmine is very career-focused. She takes after the working side of the family, I suppose. She doesn't have time for beauty regimens like Tiana does." I looked at my mother, unable to believe she had just insulted her own lineage to appease a woman who would never accept us anyway. She was stripping away my dignity to pave the road for Tiana's marriage. Mrs. Kensington gave a dismissive wave of her hand. How quaint, she sniffed. "Well, do try the shrimp cocktail. I am sure it is quite a treat for you all." She turned her back on me, dismissing me as the help, while my parents beamed as if they had just been knighted. They were so desperate for a seat at the table, they didn't realize they were on the menu. I watched from the balcony as Liam guided my father toward the cigar lounge. It was a masterclass in manipulation. My father, Marcus, hates cigars. They make him cough and give him migraines, but he lit the Cuban. Liam handed him with the enthusiasm of a man who believes inhaling smoke makes him look like a tycoon. I could not hear every word they said through the glass doors, but I did not need to. I am fluent in the body language of desperate men. Liam leaned in close, placing a hand on my father's shoulder. He was doing the heavy lifting, feeding my father's ego with a shovel. I saw Marcus puff out his chest, nodding vigorously. He looked like a king holding court, but in reality he was a jester being led to the slaughter. Later that night, I pulled the audio from the directional microphone I had slipped into my father's jacket pocket earlier. Paranoia is an occupational hazard in my line of work, but with my family it is a survival mechanism. The recording was crystal clear. Liam's voice dripped with false camaraderie. "Marcus, you are a man of vision," he said. "That is why I wanted to bring this to you first, before I open it up to the institutional investors. It is a tech startup in the fintech space, pre-IPO. We are looking at a 10 times return within 6 months, but I need to close the round by Friday. I need liquid capital, 500,000. On the recording, there was a long pause. I could hear my father exhaling smoke a little too loudly. $500,000 is more money than my father has ever seen in one place, let alone had in his bank account. A rational man would have asked for a prospectus. A honest man would have admitted he did not have the liquidity. But Marcus is neither rational nor honest. He is a man who would rather set himself on fire than admit he is cold. "Consider it done, Liam," my father said, his voice trembling slightly. "I will move some assets around tomorrow. You know how it is with offshore accounts. It takes a day or two to clear compliance." Liam sounded relieved, or perhaps just triumphant. "You are a lifesaver, Marcus," he said. "I knew Tiana came from good stock. I will have my lawyers draft the paperwork." My father laughed, a nervous sound that ended in a coughing fit. "No need for lawyers among family," he wheezed. "My word is my bond." I stopped the recording and sat in the silence of my office. My father had just promised $500,000. He did not exist to a con artist who needed it to pay off gambling debts. And I knew exactly where Marcus planned to get that money. He was going to try to steal my house. The sad part was, he thought he was being a hero. He thought he was investing in the family legacy. But all he was doing was digging a grave big enough for all of them. I did not go home to sleep that night. Instead, I drove straight to my office in the financial district. My corner office on the 45th floor was my fortress of solitude. Here, there were no gaslighting parents and no social climbers. There were only spreadsheets and the cold, hard truth. I brewed a pot of black coffee and logged into my terminal. In my line of work, we have access to databases that go far deeper than a Google search. If you have a social security number and a permissible purpose, you can see the skeleton of a person's life. And I had a very permissible purpose. I started with the Kensington Family Trust. Mrs. Kensington acted like she owned half of New England, but the county clerk's database told a different story. Their estate had 3 years of unpaid property taxes, totaling over $80,000. The bank had initiated foreclosure proceedings 6 months ago. They were fighting it with delays and legal maneuvers, but the writing was on the wall. They were not old money, they were no money. They were living on a credit float that was about to burst. But the real horror show was Liam. I pulled his credit report and it looked like a crime scene. His credit score was in the low 400s. He had maxed out 7 different credit cards and had a string of inquiries from high-risk lenders. I dug deeper, tracing the transaction codes. It was a pattern I had seen a dozen times in embezzlement cases. DraftKings, BetMGM, the Horseshoe Casino, thousands of dollars withdrawn at ATMs near racetracks. He did not have a fintech startup, he had a gambling addiction. I pulled the corporate filing for the company he mentioned to my father. It was a shell entity registered to a P.O. box in Delaware, with no assets, no employees, and no revenue. The $500,000 he asked my father for was not seed capital. It was hush money, probably to pay off a bookie before he got his legs broken. I sat back in my ergonomic chair and watched the sun rise over the lake. The golden light hit the stack of papers I had just printed. I felt a cold sense of satisfaction wash over me. My father thought he was buying into a dynasty. My mother thought she was securing a legacy. But all they had done was invite a vampire into their home. Liam was drowning, and he saw Tiana not as a wife, but as a life raft. He saw my father as a mark, and he saw my house as his bailout. I looked at the file on my desk. It was heavy with the weight of their destruction. I could have called my parents right then. I could have sent them the PDFs and ended the engagement before breakfast. But after the way they treated me at the club, after the way Tiana smashed that glass in my kitchen, I decided to wait. They wanted a show. They wanted a grand wedding with all the trimmings, so I would give them one. I would let them walk all the way to the edge of the cliff before I turned on the lights. I pulled up the live feed from the hidden camera I had installed in my parents' living room years ago. On the grainy display, I watched the facade of the happy, wealthy couple crumble completely. Vanessa was pacing back and forth, still wearing her silk robe, screaming at my father. "You told him we had the money, Marcus," she shrieked, throwing a throw pillow at the sofa. "You told him $500,000 was nothing. Where are we going to get that kind of cash by Friday? We are maxed out on the credit cards and the second mortgage is already 60 days past due." Marcus sat with his head in his hands, looking smaller and older than I had ever seen him. "I had to do it, Nessie," he pleaded, his voice cracking. "If I told him we were broke, he would have walked. He would have left Tiana. We have to keep him. He is our ticket out of this mess." The irony was suffocating. They were trying to buy a con artist with money they did not have to save a reputation that did not exist. I watched as my mother stopped pacing. Her eyes landed on the coffee table where I had deliberately left a manila folder earlier that day. It was a calculated risk, a bait car for the morally bankrupt. She walked over and picked it up, her hands trembling slightly. "What is this?" she asked, opening the file. Her eyes went wide. "It is the deed, Marcus. It is the deed to Jasmine's penthouse, and the appraisal. My God, it is valued at $2.2 million. My father looked up, desperation warring with greed on his face. He snatched the folder from her. "Let me see that." He scanned the documents, his breathing becoming shallow. "It is clean," he whispered. "Just like she said. No liens. Fully paid off." He looked at my mother and a silent understanding passed between them, a look that chilled me to the bone, even through a computer screen. It was the look of two people deciding that their daughter's property was less important than their own pride. We can borrow against it, Vanessa said, her voice low and urgent. Just a short-term bridge loan. We get the 500,000, give it to Liam. He flips his investment and we pay the bank back before Jasmine even knows the money was missing. She has so much equity sitting there doing nothing. It is sinful, really. Marcus hesitated, but only for a second. But the signature, he said. We need her signature for the loan documents. My mother let out a scoff. Oh, please, Marcus. I have been forging her signature on report cards since she was 6. We are her parents. We are entitled to this. We made her who she is. I watched as my father nodded slowly, accepting the justification. They were not just thieves. They were victims in their own minds, entitled to cannibalize their child, to feed their delusions. I reached for my wine glass. The trap was set, and they had just walked right into it, with their eyes wide open. The next afternoon, Liam texted me asking to meet at a bistro downtown to discuss Tiana's surprise gift. I knew exactly what kind of surprise he had in mind, so I made sure my phone was fully charged and the voice memo app was running before I even walked through the door. I arrived to find him sitting in a booth at the back, nursing a double scotch. He stood up to greet me, attempting to kiss my cheek, but I turned my head just in time so his lips landed on the air. He sat down and sighed, running a hand through his hair, like a misunderstood genius carrying the weight of the world. You know, Jasmine. He started leaning across the table, his eyes locking onto mine with an intensity that made my skin crawl. Tiana is wonderful, she really is, but she is a lot. She does not understand the complexities of life like we do, like you do. I sat back, sipping my sparkling water and waiting for the pitch. I know what you mean, Liam, I said, keeping my voice neutral. She has expensive taste. Liam laughed, a short, bitter sound. Expensive is an understatement. She thinks money grows on trees. But you are different. You built something real. I admire that. I really do. It is rare to find a woman who is beautiful and brilliant. He moved his hand slowly across the table until it rested on top of mine. I froze, but I did not pull away. Not. I needed him to say it loud and clear for the microphone recording in my open purse. What are you getting at, Liam? I asked. He smiled, that same shark-like smile from the party. Look, we are going to be family, right? And family shares everything. Maybe we do not need to be so rigid about boundaries. I mean, that penthouse is huge. Plenty of room for 3 people if we wanted to make an arrangement. His hand slid from my hand to my knee, squeezing firmly. Tiana does not have to know the details of our financial agreements or any other agreements. We could have a lot of fun, Jasmine. You, the smart, successful sister, and me, the partner who actually appreciates you. Tiana is just the trophy. But you could be the real prize. The bile rose in my throat. He was not just trying to steal my house, he was trying to turn me into his mistress in my own home while married to my sister. It was a level of depravity I had not anticipated even from him. I looked down at his hand on my leg, then back up at his face. That is an interesting proposition, Liam, I said, forcing a smile. But I think Tiana might have an opinion on sharing her husband. Liam waved his hand dismissively. Tiana does what she is told. She knows who holds the power. And once your father transfers that cash, we will all be holding the power together. Think about it, Jasmine. We could be a power couple. I removed his hand from my leg with 2 fingers as if it were a soiled napkin. I will certainly think about it, Liam, I said. And as I walked out, leaving him with the check, I knew I had just recorded the final nail in his coffin. I watched the live feed from my laptop screen as my mother and sister turned a felony into a fashion show. Tiana was standing in front of the ornate mirror in the hallway, pulling a wig out of a shopping bag. It was a cheap synthetic thing with tight coils meant to mimic my natural hair, but it looked more like a Halloween costume. Tiana jammed it onto her head, tucking her expensive silky weave underneath, and made a face of exaggerated disgust. God, Mom, how does she leave the house looking like this every day? Tiana laughed, turning her head from side to side. It is so unkempt. No wonder Liam looked at me like I was a goddess. Standing next to this, I am basically Miss Universe. My mother Vanessa did not scold her for the cruelty. Instead, she stepped forward to adjust the wig, pulling a few strands loose to make it look messier. It has to look authentic, Tiana, she said, her voice all business. Jasmine doesn't spend 3 hours on a blowout like you do. She has that raw, earthy look. Just try to look serious. Try to look like you have never had fun in your life. Tiana struck a pose, crossing her arms and frowning, mimicking my resting face. I am Jasmine, she droned in a monotone voice. I like spreadsheets and saving money and being a joyless spinster. They both erupted into laughter. It was a sound that made my skin prickle, not because it hurt my feelings, but because it revealed exactly who they were. They did not just want my money, they wanted to erase me. Tiana sat down at the dining table where my mother had spread out several sheets of printer paper. She picked up a black gel pen, the same kind I use, and began to practice. She had one of my old birthday cards next to her, using it as a reference. Jasmine, Brooks, she muttered, focusing on the curvature of the letters. She held up the paper for inspection. How is this? My mother leaned over, squinting at the forgery. The J needs to be bigger, Vanessa critiqued, pointing a manicured finger at the page. She loops her J wide at the bottom. It is childish, really, like she is trying to take up space she does not deserve. Do it again. Tiana sighed and scribbled another signature. There. That is perfect. Honestly, her signature is as boring as she is. Anyone could copy this. I cannot believe she just left the deed sitting on the coffee table. For someone who thinks she is the smartest person in the room, she is incredibly stupid. She is arrogant, Vanessa corrected, pouring herself a glass of wine. She thinks she is untouchable because she has a fancy job and a penthouse. She thinks we are beneath her. That is why she got careless. She never thought we would have the guts to do what is necessary. Tiana smirked, spinning the pen between her fingers. Well, she thought wrong. Tomorrow I walk into that bank as Jasmine and I walk out with our future. And the best part is, she won't even know until it is too late. By the time she figures it out, Liam and I will be married, the money will be invested, and there is nothing she can do about it without sending her own mother and sister to jail. And we know she won't do that. She is too desperate for our approval. I watched them toast to their crime, clinking their glasses over the practice sheets filled with my name. Tiana looked at her reflection again, adjusting the wig. You know, looking like her isn't so bad when it pays this well, she said. I closed the laptop with a snap. They were banking on my silence. They were banking on my desperate need for family. But they had forgotten one thing. I am an accountant, and I always balance the books. I sat in my car parked across the street from the First National Bank, watching the entrance like a hawk. I did not need binoculars to spot my sister. Tiana walked into the downtown branch wearing a navy pantsuit that she definitely planned to return to the store the next day. The synthetic wig sat slightly askew on her head, and she kept adjusting her oversized sunglasses like she was a celebrity avoiding the paparazzi instead of a felon committing fraud. I had my phone on speaker, connected to an open line on the desk of David, the senior loan officer. David was not just a banker, he was my former college roommate, and he knew exactly what was about to happen. Through the phone, I heard the heavy oak door of his office close. Tiana's voice was high and tight, trembling with a mixture of adrenaline and fear. I am here to finalize the bridge loan, she said, pushing the stolen folder across the mahogany desk. My husband and I need the funds expedited for a business venture. David played his part perfectly. I could hear the rustle of papers as he opened the file. He hummed thoughtfully, scanning the documents that I had prepared and that my family had stolen. Everything appears to be in order, Ms. Brooks, he said, using my name. The appraisal is solid and the equity is there. I just need to verify your identification for federal compliance. This was the moment of truth. On the security feed I accessed later, I saw Tiana freeze. Her entire body went rigid. She had clearly practiced the signature, but she had not anticipated the scrutiny of a face-to-face verification. Her hand shook visibly as she reached into her designer purse. She pulled out a driver's license and slid it across the desk, holding her breath. I knew exactly what it was. It was an old, expired license of mine that went missing after a family barbecue 3 years ago. I had assumed I lost it, but Tiana had kept it, probably waiting for a moment just like this. David picked up the ID. He looked at the photo of me, then looked up at Tiana in her bad wig and heavy makeup. The resemblance was passing at best. Any competent teller would have pressed the silent alarm immediately. The air in the office was thick enough to cut with a knife. Tiana began to fidget, tapping her manicured nails on the leather armrest. "I colored my hair," she blurted out unprompted, "and I lost a little weight." David paused for a heartbeat longer than necessary, enjoying the squirming of a criminal. Then he smiled. "Of course, Ms. Brooks," he said, handing the ID back. "You look fantastic. Everything seems to be in order." Tiana practically melted with relief, letting out a breath she must have been holding since the parking lot. David pushed the loan documents toward her. "I just need your signature here, here, and here," he said, pointing to the lines. Tiana grabbed the pen and scribbled my name with a speed born of desperation. She did not read the terms. She did not read the fine print. She just signed away her freedom one loop at a time. "Excellent," David said, closing the file. "The funds will be wired to the account provided within 48 hours pending final review." Tiana stood up, her knees knocking against the desk in her haste to leave. "Thank you," she breathed. "You have no idea how much this helps." She walked out of the bank with a swagger that returned the moment she hit the sidewalk. She pulled out her phone immediately, likely texting our mother that the deed was done. She thought she had just secured $500,000. She had no idea that the account provided was a dummy account monitored by the fraud department, and that the only thing she had successfully secured was a paper trail that would lead her straight to a prison cell. The atmosphere inside my parents' house shifted from desperate to euphoric the moment Tiana walked through the door. She tossed the cheap synthetic wig onto the beige sofa like it was a trophy from a successful hunting trip. My mother, Vanessa, was already there with a bottle of Dom Perignon that I knew for a fact they could not afford. She popped the cork with a festive sound that echoed through the room, and foam spilled onto the carpet she used to yell at me for walking on with shoes. They did not care about stains today. Today they believed they had pulled off the heist of the century. Tiana accepted a flute of champagne, her hands no longer shaking. She took a long gulp and let out a dramatic sigh of relief. It was so easy, she bragged, her voice loud and grating. The banker did not even blink. He just looked at the ID, looked at me, and stamped the papers. "I told you Jasmine was predictable. She leaves her trail everywhere." My father Marcus was pacing the room, but this time there was a bounce in his step. He pulled out his phone and dialed Liam. I could not hear Liam's side of the conversation, but I did not need to. My father's voice was booming with false bravado. "Liam, my boy," he shouted into the receiver. "The liquidity issue is resolved. Yes, we moved some assets around. The wire transfer is initiated. You will have the full 500,000 by Friday morning, just in time to close your round." He paused, listening to Liam's likely effusive praise. "No, no, do not thank me. That is what family is for. We take care of our own." He hung up and turned to the women, raising his glass high. To the Kensingtons he toasted. "And to us, the people who make things happen." I watched this entire performance from the screen of my smartphone, sitting in the dim light of my penthouse living room. I had a glass of wine in my hand too, but mine was a vintage Cabernet paid for with clean, honest money. It was fascinating in a morbid way to watch them celebrate their own destruction. They were toasting to a felony. They were drinking to bank fraud, identity theft, and conspiracy. They truly believed that the money hitting that account on Friday would be their salvation. They did not know that the account Tiana had wired the funds to was a flagged escrow account controlled by the FBI's Financial Crimes Division. Every dollar that moved through there was marked. Every signature was evidence. I took a slow, deliberate sip of wine, letting the rich, tannic taste settle on my tongue. My father was hugging Tiana now, telling her how proud he was of her bravery. My mother was already talking about booking a first-class flight to Paris for the honeymoon. They looked so happy, so relieved. It was almost a shame that I was going to burn their entire fantasy to the ground in less than 48 hours. But as I watched Tiana kick my old driver's license under the coffee table, laughing at how stupid I was, any flicker of guilt I might have felt was extinguished. They had made their choice. Now they would have to live with the audit. The courier arrived at my office with a box that looked like it contained the crown jewels, but instead it held the wedding invitations. Tiana had insisted on delivering mine personally. She breezed past my assistant and threw herself into the guest chair opposite my desk, looking like the cat who had just swallowed a very expensive canary. "Open it," she commanded, nodding at the cream-colored envelope she had placed on top of my quarterly reports. "It is letterpress on triple-weight cardstock." Liam's mother chose the font. It is the same one the Kennedys used in 1953. I picked up the envelope, feeling the weight of the pretense inside. I used my silver letter opener to slice the seal and pulled out the invitation. It was beautiful, I had to admit. Elegant, understated, and completely funded by credit card debt. I slid the reception card out, expecting to see a table number near the front. After all, I was the sister of the bride. I was the one whose identity they had stolen to secure the financing. Surely that earned me a seat near the head table. I looked at the number embossed in gold. Table 42. I frowned. "Tiana," I said, keeping my voice level, "the floor plan you showed me only had 30 tables in the main ballroom. Where is table 42? Tiana examined her manicure, pretending to find a non-existent chip in the polish. "Oh, well, we had to make some last-minute adjustments. The Kensingtons added more guests than we expected. Senators, judges, people of consequence. So table 42 is in the annex." "The annex," I repeated. "You mean the alcove near the kitchen service doors, the place where the waiters stack the dirty dishes." Tiana sighed, rolling her eyes as if I were being intentionally difficult. "It is not that bad, Jasmine. It is actually very private. You will be sitting with the nannies and some of the staff's children. It will be quiet. Besides, it is better this way. Better for who?" I asked, feeling a cold anger settling in my chest. "Better for the aesthetic," Tiana said, finally meeting my eyes. "Look, Jasmine, do not take this personally. But Liam's friends, they are used to a certain level of polish. And you look heavy." I blinked. "Heavy?" I asked. She gestured vaguely at my tailored business suit, at my natural hair, at my entire existence. "You look like you work for a living," she said, wrinkling her nose. "It is very aggressive, very corporate. It just does not fit the vibe of effortless generational wealth we are going for. I do not want Liam's friends asking why the bride's sister looks like she is about to audit their taxes. It kills the fantasy. So just sit in the annex, keep your head down, and try not to embarrass me. Can you do that? Can you just be invisible for one night?" She was ashamed of me. She wanted to steal the house I bought with my hard work, but she was ashamed of the work itself. She wanted the fruit but despised the root. I looked at the invitation again. Table 42, the seat of the outcast. I looked back at my sister, who was waiting for my submission. I forced a smile onto my face. "Of course, Tiana," I said, sliding the card back into the envelope. "I understand completely. I will sit in the back. I will be so quiet you won't even know I am there." "Until it is time for my speech," I added silently in my head. She clapped her hands, delighted that I had accepted my demotion without a fight. She bounced out of the office, dreaming of her perfect day. She had no idea that by putting me in the back, she had just given me the best seat in the house to watch her world burn. Uncle James called me an hour after Tiana left my office. His voice was sober and serious, lacking the playful edge he usually carried after a few drinks. He asked me to meet him at his brownstone in Bronzeville. It was the house my grandparents had bought in the 50s, the only piece of real estate my father had not managed to get his hands on yet. When I arrived, James was sitting in his leather armchair surrounded by stacks of yellowing paper. He did not offer me a drink. He just pointed to a box on the ottoman. "You need to see this, Jasmine," he said. "You are planning to expose them at the wedding, and I support you in but you need to know that this goes deeper than just your house." I sat down and opened the box. It was not filled with family photos or heirlooms. It was filled with bank statements, old ones, dating back 10 years. I picked up a stack from the year my grandfather died. I saw withdrawals, massive ones, 5,000 here, 10,000 there, all listed as caregiver expenses or medical bills. But I knew my grandfather had full coverage from his union job. I looked at the checks. The signatures were shaky, clearly forged, and the payee was always the same. Marcus Brooks. My father. They told everyone Grandma and Grandpa died broke because of bad investments. James said, his voice shaking with suppressed rage. They told the church they had to pay for the funeral out of their own pockets to look like martyrs. But the truth is, your parents drained them dry. They stole their retirement fund, Jasmine. And do you know what they spent it on? Look at the dates. I cross-referenced the dates with my mental timeline of our family history. June 12, 2015. A $15,000 withdrawal. That was the week Tiana got her nose job for her 18th birthday. August 4th, 2016. $20,000. That was the down payment on Tiana's first BMW. The pattern was undeniable. They had cannibalized my grandparents' life savings not to survive, but to fund Tiana's vanity. They had stolen the comfort of the elderly to buy luxury goods for the golden child. I felt a cold numbness spread through my chest. For years I had held on to a tiny shred of guilt. I thought maybe my parents were just bad with money. Maybe they were just desperate victims of a capitalist system trying to give their children a better life. But this was not desperation. This was predation. They were parasites who fed on anyone who showed them kindness. First my grandparents, now me. And soon Liam if I did not stop them. I looked up at Uncle James. "Does Tiana know?" I asked. James shook his head. "She does not know where the money came from. She just knows she got what she wanted. She never asks questions, Jasmine. That is her superpower. She is willfully blind." I closed the box and stood up. The last remnants of hesitation evaporated from my spirit. I was no longer just fighting for my house. I was fighting for my grandfather who worked in a steel mill for 40 years, only to have his son steal his legacy. I was fighting for my grandmother who died in a state facility because her private care fund was spent on designer handbags. I looked at Uncle James and nodded. "Can I borrow this box?" I asked. He smiled a grim, determined smile. "Take it," he said, "and bury them with it." I walked out of his house carrying the weight of the past in my arms, ready to unleash a storm that would wash the slate clean. The deadline was closing in like a noose and Liam was starting to panic. I sat in my car outside my parents' house, monitoring the audio bug I had planted in the den. It was Friday morning. The funds from the fraudulent loan were supposed to have cleared by now, but thanks to a quiet word I had with my contact at the bank, the wire was stuck in administrative review. My father's phone rang on the coffee table. He picked it up on the first ring, his hand shaking so badly he almost dropped it. "Hey, Liam," he said, his voice cracking with forced cheerfulness. "I was just about to call you." I did not hear cheerfulness on the other end. I heard rage. "Where is the money?" Marcus Liam shouted loud enough that the microphone picked up his voice clearly, without speakerphone. "It is 10 a.m. My investors are waiting. I look like an idiot standing here with my pockets empty. You said the wire would hit this morning. Do you know who you are dealing with?" My father shrank into the sofa, looking small and pathetic. "I know, Liam. I know," he stammered, wiping sweat from his forehead. "It is just a banking glitch. You know how these big transfers are. Compliance checks and all that. I called the branch manager myself. He said it should be any minute now. Just hold tight, son." "Do not call me son." Liam snapped. "Call me when the money is in my account. If that wire does not hit by noon, the deal is off. And if the deal is off, the wedding is off. Do you understand me? You will explain to your precious daughter why she is crying at the altar because her father is a broke liar." The line went dead. My father stared at the phone, his face gray and ashen. He looked like a man who had just looked into the abyss and seen his own reflection. My mother, Vanessa, rushed into the room, wringing her hands. "What did he say?" she asked, her eyes wide with terror. "Is he still angry?" Marcus looked up at her, his eyes hollow. "He says noon, Vanessa. We have until noon, or the wedding is off." He stood up, pacing the room like a caged animal. "Call Tiana. Tell her to go back to the bank. Tell her to cry if she has to. Tell her to flirt with the manager. I do not care what she does, but she needs to get that money released. Now." I sat in my car listening to the chaos I had orchestrated. It was a cruel symphony but necessary. They were running around trying to fix a leak on a sinking ship, while I was the one holding the plug. They were terrified of losing Liam. They were terrified of the social embarrassment, but not once did I hear them worry about the felony they had committed to get the money. Not once did they worry about me. They were only sorry that their crime wasn't paying out fast enough. I checked my watch. It was 10:15. I decided to let them sweat for another hour before I went to get my hair done for the rehearsal dinner. After all, I had to look my best for the main event. The doorbell rang at exactly 11:45, cutting through the tension in my parents' living room like a knife. My father, Marcus, practically ripped the door off its hinges, expecting a courier with a certified check or perhaps a personal apology from the bank president. Instead, he found a uniformed process server who handed him a thick envelope marked "Urgent" from First National Bank. He tore it open right there in the hallway, not even waiting to get back to the couch. I watched on the monitor as his face went from hopeful to confused, and finally to a shade of pale gray that matched the expansive debt he was drowning in. Vanessa was at his side, instantly clawing at his arm like a desperate bird. "Is it the money, Marcus?" she demanded, her voice shrill. "Is the wire released? Did they send a cashier's check instead?" Marcus walked into the living room and collapsed onto the sofa, his legs seemingly giving out beneath him. "It is a notice of administrative hold," he said, his voice flat and hollow. He read from the paper, his hands trembling enough to rattle the page. "Brooks, due to irregular activity detected by our algorithm, your transaction has been flagged for a Level 3 security review by the Fraud Prevention Unit. Please contact us immediately to verify the origin of these assets." Vanessa snatched the paper from him, her eyes scanning the text frantically. "Fraud prevention," she shrieked. "Why would they flag it?" We answered all their questions. Tiana went down there herself. She signed everything. Then began the mental gymnastics that my family is so famous for. I watched as my parents, two people who had just committed a felony, tried to convince themselves that they were simply victims of corporate bureaucracy. Marcus stood up and straightened his jacket, trying to regain a shred of his crumbling composure. "It is just standard procedure, Nessie," he said, attempting to sound authoritative, but failing miserably. "It is a large amount of money. $500,000 triggers these automatic checks. It means they take us seriously. They are just being thorough because they know we are high-value clients. They want to protect our assets from hackers." He was lying to himself and he knew it. High-value clients get phone calls from their private bankers while they are playing golf. Criminals get certified letters from the fraud department. But Vanessa, desperate to believe the lie, grabbed onto it like a lifeline. "Of course," she breathed, smoothing her hair and checking her reflection in the mirror. "You are right. It is probably just because Tiana looks so young. They want to make sure she is not being taken advantage of. It is actually good customer service if you think about it. We just need to call them and clear this up. It is just a misunderstanding." Marcus nodded, pulling out his phone with renewed determination. "I will call the number on the letter. I will tell them to expedite this. I will tell them Liam Kensington is waiting and they do not want to offend a Kensington." He dialed the number, his arrogance returning with every digit he pressed. He had no idea that the number on that letter did not go to customer service. It went directly to the desk of the regional investigator who had already forwarded the file to the district attorney. I took another sip of my coffee in the safety of my penthouse. The trap had not just sprung, it had locked them inside and they were still busy rearranging the furniture. They were so convinced of their own importance that they could not hear the sound of the cage door slamming shut. They thought this was a delay. I knew it was the beginning of the end. Tiana explicitly told me to wear something understated. She suggested a beige pantsuit or perhaps a gray modest dress that would help me blend into the drapes at the back of the room. I stood in my walk-in closet, looking at the rows of charcoal blazers and sensible heels that had defined my existence for so long. They were the armor of the invisible woman. But tonight I was not going to be invisible. I reached past the gray and pulled out the garment bag I had been saving for a special occasion. I unzipped it and the fabric spilled out like liquid fire. It was a vintage Valentino gown in a shade of crimson so deep and vibrant it looked dangerous. It was backless, with a plunging neckline and a slit that ran up to the thigh. It was not a dress for an accountant. It was a dress for a femme fatale. It was the color of a warning light. It was the color of blood. It was the color of war. I slipped into the silk and zipped it up. It fit like a second skin. I looked in the mirror and for the first time in years, I did not see the reliable sister or the dutiful daughter. I saw a predator. I applied my lipstick a shade of red that matched the dress perfectly. Tiana wanted me to sit in the annex with the children. She wanted me to be hidden. I was going to make sure that was physically impossible. I was going to be the brightest thing in the room. A walking, talking siren that they could not ignore, no matter how hard they tried. I walked over to my desk where my laptop was humming. The screen displayed a folder named The Truth. Inside were the PDFs of the bank fraud, the audio recordings of Liam and my father, and the scans of the stolen retirement funds. I inserted a heavy gold-plated USB drive into the port. It was a small thing no bigger than a lipstick, but it held enough explosive material to level a city block. I dragged the files over and watched the progress bar fill up green, 100% complete. I pulled the drive out, feeling its weight in my palm. It felt cold and solid. I dropped it into my crystal clutch, snapping the clasp shut with a satisfying click. This was not just data, it was my vindication. It was the receipt for every time they called me selfish, every time they called me ugly, and every time they stole from me. I grabbed my shawl and walked to the elevator. The show was about to start, and I had the only script that mattered. The Gold Coast room at the Drake Hotel is where Chicago's elite go to pretend they are royalty, and tonight my parents were playing the part of the king and queen. The room was a kaleidoscope of crystal chandeliers and silk drapery smelling of old money and fresh lilies. I stood in the archway for a moment, taking it all in. My father, Marcus, was at the center of the room, loudly berating a sommelier about the vintage of the wine. He demanded a bottle of Chateau Petrus that cost more than his car. I felt my phone buzz against my hip in the clutch. It was a fraud alert from my bank. A pending charge of $6,000 for alcohol service at the Drake. They had not just stolen my identity to get a loan, they had lifted my credit card numbers from my office when Tiana visited. They were throwing this party on my dime without even having the decency to ask. I swiped the notification away. I did not decline the charge. I wanted the receipt. Every bottle of wine was just another piece of evidence for the district attorney. I stepped into the light, and the effect was instantaneous. The hum of conversation died down as heads turned toward the door. The red Valentino dress did exactly what it was designed to do. It screamed for attention. I saw Tiana drop her fork. She looked at me with a mixture of horror and jealousy. She was wearing a white cocktail dress meant to signify her purity and innocence, but next to my crimson silk, she looked washed out and pale. My mother, Vanessa's eyes bulged, and she made a move to stand up, likely to march over and drag me out, but my father grabbed her arm. He whispered something in her ear. probably reminding her that making a scene in front of the Kensingtons would be fatal. I smiled a cold, sharp smile and began my walk across the room. A maitre d' in a tuxedo intercepted me looking pained. "Ms. Brooks," he said, his voice hushed and apologetic. "I believe there has been a mistake with the seating chart, but your mother insisted." He gestured vaguely toward the back of the room. I followed him past the head table where Liam was ignoring Tiana to check the sports scores on his phone. I walked past the investors my father was trying to impress. I walked all the way to the back corner directly next to the swinging doors of the service kitchen. Table 42 was a small folding table, covered in a tablecloth that did not quite match the others. I was seated next to the coat check girl and two toddlers, who were currently throwing bread rolls at each other. I sat down gracefully, smoothing the silk of my dress. The contrast was stark. A woman in a $5,000 gown sitting in the penalty box. A young waiter approached with a pitcher of water. He looked at the head table where my family was laughing and eating caviar, then looked at me in the shadows. His eyes held a deep, genuine pity. "I am so sorry, ma'am," he whispered, pouring my water. "Can I get you a drink from the bar? It is on the house." I looked up at him and smiled. "That is very kind of you," I said. "But do not worry about me. The view from here is perfect. I have a clear line of sight to everyone I need to destroy." He walked away confused, but I settled in. I watched my father sign the bill for the wine with a flourish, using a hand that shook slightly. He thought he was getting away with it. He did not know that the real bill was coming due, and the interest rate was going to be catastrophic. Charles Kensington stood up, tapping a silver spoon against his crystal goblet, demanding the silence he believed was his birthright. He was a man who wore his arrogance like a second skin, tailored and expensive. The room fell hushed as he adjusted his bow tie and looked out over the crowd. He did not look at the back of the room where I sat. He looked only at his peers, the senators and the CEOs, people who came from the right zip codes. "We Kensingtons take great pride in our history," he began, his voice booming with a practiced mid-Atlantic accent. "Our ancestors came to this country on the Mayflower. We have served in the Senate, we have led industry, and we have always understood the value of pedigree." He paused to let the word sink in. Pedigree. It was a dog-breeding term applied to human beings. He turned his gaze toward the head table, where my parents sat freezing in their rented finery. "When Liam told us he had found a girl, we were naturally cautious," Charles continued. "We believe in the old ways. We believe that marriage is not just a union of hearts, but a merging of histories. It is about maintaining standards." He smiled, a thin, tight expression that looked painful. "But then we met Marcus and Vanessa, and we saw that while they may not have our history, they certainly have energy. They are so industrious, so eager to climb. It is quite charming, really, to see such new money enthusiasm." He used the term new money like a slur dressed up in a tuxedo. He was calling them scrappy. He was calling them social climbers. He was telling the entire room that my parents were guests in his world, not citizens. My father Marcus did not hear the insult. He sat there beaming, nodding his head like a bobblehead doll desperate for approval. He heard the word money and stopped listening. He thought he was being praised for his business acumen. He did not realize he was being patted on the head like a clever retriever who had learned to walk on two legs. Mrs. Kensington chimed in, then remaining seated but raising her glass. "Yes, indeed," she said, her voice dripping with saccharine venom. "And we are so pleased that Tiana is so adaptable. She fits right in with our aesthetic. She understands that to be a Kensington is to value tradition over loud displays of individuality." She cast a fleeting glance toward the back of the room, toward my red dress, but quickly looked away as if the sight of me caused her physical pain. "She is a blank canvas," Mrs. Kensington finished. "And we are so happy to paint the Kensington future upon her." The room applauded, polite golf claps that sounded like dry leaves skittering on pavement. I sat in the shadows, clutching my water glass so hard I thought it might shatter. They were not welcoming Tiana into the family. They were acquiring her, They saw her as a vessel, a pretty object to be molded into their image. And my parents were selling her for a seat at a table that was already rotting from the inside out. I looked at Liam, who was smirking. He didn't care about pedigree. He just cared that the check cleared. He was the most dangerous kind of aristocrat, the kind who had lost his fortune but kept his entitlement. I took a sip of water, washing down the bitter taste of their hypocrisy. Let them talk about history, I thought. I was about to give them a history lesson they would never forget. My father Marcus wiped his mouth with a linen napkin and stood up. He adjusted his suit jacket buttons, a gesture he always used to hide his nervousness. He walked to the podium, the spotlight following him like a moth to a flame. He cleared his throat into the microphone, a harsh sound that echoed through the ballroom. Charles talks about history. He began, his voice trembling slightly before finding its footing. But I talk about the future. I am a self-made man. I started with nothing. And tonight, I am proud to give my daughter everything she deserves. He paused for effect, looking out at the sea of faces that he desperately wanted to impress. He wanted them to see a tycoon. He wanted them to see a patriarch. He did not want them to see a thief. There has been some speculation about where the happy couple will live. Marcus continued, smiling benevolently at Tiana. Well, I am pleased to put those rumors to rest. As of this morning, my wife and I have officially transferred the deed to the penthouse on Lakeshore Drive to Tiana and Liam. It is a humble $2 million starter home, but we hope it serves as a foundation for your new life. The room erupted. Gasps of admiration rippled through the crowd. This was the currency they understood. Real estate, assets, power. Tiana brought her hands to her face, sobbing theatrically. She looked at Liam with wet, shimmering eyes, performing the role of the grateful daughter perfectly. "Oh, Daddy," she wailed, soft enough to be cute but loud enough to be heard. "You are too generous." Liam leaned back in his chair, a smug grin spreading across his face. He looked at my father not with gratitude, but with the satisfaction of a predator who had just been fed. He raised his glass to Marcus, a silent acknowledgement of the transaction. He thought he had won. He thought the game was over. He thought the check had cleared and the house was his. The applause grew louder, a standing ovation for the lie. My mother Vanessa was beaming, dabbing her eyes with a handkerchief, looking every inch the proud matriarch. I stood up. The scraping of my chair against the floor was lost in the applause, but the flash of red silk was not. I walked out of the shadows of the annex. I walked past the dirty dishes and the coat check. I walked past table 10 where the cousins were whispering. I moved with a slow, deliberate cadence. The applause began to die down as people noticed me. The woman in the red dress, the outcast returning from exile. The silence spread like a contagion, starting from the back of the room and rushing toward the stage. My father saw me approaching and his smile faltered. His eyes widened in panic. "Sit down, Jasmine," he hissed away from the mic, his face turning pale. "This is not about you. Go back to your seat." I did not sit down. I walked right up to the head table. I picked up a silver knife and tapped it against my crystal champagne flute. The sound was sharp and piercing, cutting through the murmurs. I climbed the steps to the stage, my heels clicking rhythmically on the hardwood. I reached out and gently took the microphone from my father's frozen hand. He was too stunned to stop me. "Thank you for that generous introduction, Dad," I said, my voice amplified and steady, booming through the speakers. "But I think there is a small correction to be made. You see, you cannot give away a house that you do not own. And while we are correcting things, let us talk about who actually paid for this party." The silence in the ballroom was absolute. It was the heavy, suffocating silence that usually precedes a natural disaster. My father Marcus stood frozen next to me, his hand still reaching for the microphone I had just commandeered. His face was a mask of sheer terror because for the first time in his life, he was not in control of the narrative. He opened his mouth to shout for security, but no sound came out. He was paralyzed by the realization that he had pushed me too far. I turned to face the crowd, letting the spotlight hit the sequins on my crimson dress. turning me into a pillar of fire against the backdrop of their polite monochrome world. I saw the confusion on the faces of the senators and the judges. They were waiting for a drunken rant or a tearful sisterly tribute. They had no idea they were about to witness a forensic autopsy of a family. I smiled a smile that was sharp enough to cut glass. "Thank you, Dad, for that moving work of fiction," I said into the microphone, my voice calm and clear, echoing off the vaulted ceiling. "You talk so much about legacy and history tonight. You talk about what makes a family. And since the Kensingtons are so obsessed with pedigree and knowing exactly where we come from, I thought it would be appropriate to share a little visual history of our own." Before we toast the happy couple, let us take a look at the receipts. I emphasized the word receipts, letting it hang in the air like a threat. I walked over to the audio-visual station set up to the side of the stage. The technician, a young man in a headset, looked at me with wide eyes. He started to block the port, but I shot him a look that said, "Move or lose your job." He stepped aside instantly. My mother Vanessa was on her feet now, screaming from the table. "Jasmine, stop this right now. You are drunk. Someone get her off the stage." Her voice was shrill and desperate, a stark contrast to the elegant image she had tried to curate all night. Tiana looked like she was going to be sick. She gripped the tablecloth, her knuckles white, staring at the massive projection screen that was slowly descending from the ceiling behind me. I ignored my mother's screams. I ignored my father, who was now lunging toward me. I pulled the heavy gold-plated USB drive from my clutch. It felt cool and solid in my hand like a loaded weapon. I plugged it into the main console and the system chimed, acknowledging the device. I typed in the password with steady fingers, JUSTICE. The projector hummed to life, beaming a bright blue light onto the screen. I turned back to the microphone one last time. "Everyone loves a good slideshow at a wedding, right?" I asked the stunned audience. "It usually features baby pictures and first steps. But our family is different. We do not deal in nostalgia. We deal in numbers. So please sit back, relax, and pay close attention. Because the truth is about to be projected in high definition." I hit the enter key. The screen flickered, and the room went dark. The image on the screen was grainy, but the definition was high enough to ruin a reputation instantly. It was the security feed from First National Bank, time-stamped 48 hours ago. The woman in the frame was wearing a navy suit that was 2 sizes too big and a wig that looked like it had been salvaged from a dumpster fire. But the face underneath the synthetic curls was unmistakable. A collective gasp sucked the air out of the ballroom. It was a sound I will cherish forever, the sound of absolute, undeniable shock. I watched as the video played in silence. On the screen, Tiana looked nervous. She checked her reflection in the bank officer's window. Then she picked up a pen and signed a document. The camera zoomed in digitally, a feature I had added myself to highlight the forgery. There it was, in black and white. My name signed by her hand. I spoke into the microphone, my voice cutting through the stunned silence. "For those of you in the back who cannot see, let me narrate. That is my sister, Tiana, wearing a wig to impersonate me. And that document she is signing is a loan application using my social security number and my property deed as collateral. You see, my father just announced he gave them a house, but the truth is they tried to steal it." My father, Marcus, lunged for the power cord, his face a shade of purple that suggested an imminent stroke. "Turn it off," he screamed, his voice cracking. "It is a fake. It is AI generated. Do not look at it." He scrambled on his hands and knees, fumbling with the wires, but the technician backed away, refusing to help him. Tiana sat at the head table, frozen like a statue. The color had drained from her face, leaving her looking gray and ghostly under the chandeliers. She stared at herself on the screen, at the cheap wig and the desperate expression, and she knew her life was over. She was not the beautiful bride anymore. She was a criminal in HD. Mrs. Kensington raised a hand to her mouth. "Oh my God," she whispered loud enough for the microphone to pick up. Is that? Is that a polyester wig? The absurdity of her focusing on the fashion crime while a felony was being broadcast was almost funny, almost. I continued my presentation relentlessly. As you can see, folks, identity theft is a family affair. They did not have the cash for the dowry, so they decided to mortgage my future to pay for their present. And the best part is they thought I would be too embarrassed to say anything. They thought I would sit in the back and eat my dinner like a good little girl. I looked down at my mother, who had slumped in her chair, her eyes rolled back in a faint that might have been real or might have been another performance. It did not matter. The damage was done. The Kensingtons were staring at my family not with disdain, but with horror. They realized they were not merging with a dynasty. They were merging with a racketeering operation. And I was just getting started. I clicked the remote in my hand, and the image on the screen shifted with a sharp digital snap. The video of my sister in her discount wig disappeared and was replaced by a high-resolution scan of a letter on First National Bank letterhead. The words, "Notice of Adverse Action," were highlighted in bold red letters at the top. I pointed the laser pointer at the screen, circling the reason for rejection. Identity fraud. The room was so quiet, you could hear the ice melting in the champagne buckets. I looked down at my father, who had given up on finding the power cord and was now kneeling on the stage floor, staring up at his failure in 10-foot letters. "I am sorry to break it to you, Dad," I said, my voice dripping with faux sympathy. "But there is no wire transfer coming. There never was. That administrative hold you told Liam about was actually me calling the fraud department and flagging the transaction. You do not have $500,000. You do not even have $500. You are broke, Marcus. And you just tried to pay for your daughter's husband with a line of credit stolen from your other daughter. The math simply does not work out." I turned my attention to the head table where Liam was sitting. He looked like he wanted to dissolve into the floor. His face was a mask of sweat and panic. "And speaking of math, Liam, let us talk about your liquidity issues." I walked to the edge of the stage, looking down at him like a bug under a microscope. "You were pressing my father so hard for that cash. You said it was for a fintech startup. You said it was a pre-IPO opportunity. But we both know that is not true." I clicked the remote again. The screen changed to a spreadsheet. It was a list of transactions from Liam's personal bank account: DraftKings, BetMGM, the Horseshoe Casino, the Venetian Las Vegas. The numbers were in the red, and they were massive. "You are not an entrepreneur, Liam," I announced to the room. "You are a gambling addict. You needed that $500,000 to pay off a bookie in simplistic terms before they broke your kneecaps. You did not want to marry Tiana. You wanted to marry a bailout. You saw a desperate family and you thought you found the perfect mark, but you forgot to check if the accountant in the family was paying attention." Mrs. Kensington let out a strangled cry and clutched her husband's arm. "Is this true?" she gasped, staring at her son. Liam tried to speak, to stammer out a denial, but the evidence was glowing blue behind me. He looked from his mother to my father and then to Tiana. The triangle of lies had collapsed. He wasn't the savior of the Brooks family. He was just another parasite looking for a host. And I had just cut off the blood supply. I looked at Tiana, who was staring at Liam with horror. She wasn't horrified that he was a gambler. She was horrified that he was broke. Her entire future, her status, her Kensington name had just evaporated into thin air. And she had committed a felony for absolutely nothing. I clicked the remote one more time. The spreadsheet of Liam's gambling losses vanished and was replaced by a PDF that made the room gasp even louder than the wig video. It was a foreclosure notice from the Cook County Sheriff's Office addressed to Charles and Elizabeth Kensington. Next to it was a tax lien for 3 years of unpaid property taxes totaling over $85,000. I walked to the edge of the stage and looked directly at Mrs. Kensington, who was currently clutching her pearls as if they were the only thing keeping her upright. "You asked me so many questions about my property taxes at the engagement party, Mrs. Kensington," I said, my voice cool and mocking. You were so concerned about assessments and upkeep. I thought you were just being rude, but it turns out you were projecting. You were not worried about my finances. You were worried about your own. The room erupted into chaos. My father, Marcus, who had been kneeling on the floor in defeat, suddenly scrambled to his feet. He stared at the screen, his eyes bulging. He looked at the foreclosure notice, and then he looked at Charles Kensington. The realization hit him like a physical blow. He had debased himself, committed fraud, and betrayed his own flesh and blood to marry his daughter into a fortune that did not exist. "You are broke," Marcus screamed, pointing a shaking finger at Charles. "You told me you were liquid. You told me you were old money. You said your ancestors came over on the Mayflower." Charles Kensington stood up, his face flushing a deep beet red. He adjusted his tie, trying to maintain his dignity amidst the wreckage. "We are experiencing a temporary cash flow issue," Charles stammered. "It is a liquidity crunch. It happens to all great families." "A liquidity crunch?" My mother Vanessa shrieked, finding her voice. "You are homeless. You are literally homeless. We bought you first-class tickets to Paris. We paid for this entire reception. You have been eating our food and drinking our wine and judging us the entire time while you don't even have a pot to piss in." She lunged across the gap between the tables, grabbing Mrs. Kensington's vintage Chanel jacket. "You called my daughter," Urban Vanessa screamed, shaking the older woman. "You looked down your nose at us. And you are nothing but a fraud in a rented suit." Mrs. Kensington slapped my mother's hand away, her face twisting into a mask of pure ugly rage. "Get your hands off me, you desperate little social climber," she hissed. "We may be having financial difficulties, but we are still Kensingtons. We are still better than you. You are just gutter trash with a little bit of credit card debt." I watched from the stage as the two families who had been toasting each other 10 minutes ago tore each other apart. It was a beautiful disaster. My father was shouting at Liam, calling him a con artist. Liam was shouting back, calling my father a gullible fool. The facade of civility had completely shattered, revealing the rot underneath. They deserved each other, I thought. The liars and the fakes, the grifters and the marks. They were a perfect match in hell. I waited for the shouting match between my mother and Mrs. Kensington to reach a lull before I delivered the final blow. The room was already a smoking crater of destroyed reputations and financial ruin, but I had one last piece of evidence that would shatter the emotional core of this farce. I tapped the microphone one last time. The sharp feedback cut through the din, silencing the brawling in-laws. "I have one final presentation," I said, my voice calm amidst the storm. "We have talked about money. We have talked about fraud. Now let us talk about love. Or rather, Liam's version of it." I pressed the spacebar. The screen went black and a green audio waveform appeared, oscillating to the rhythm of the recording. The quality was crystal clear, recorded in the quiet intimacy of the bistro just 2 days prior. Liam's voice boomed through the ballroom speakers, amplified to a godlike volume. "Tiana is wonderful, really," the recording played, "but she is simple. She is a lot of work. She thinks money grows on trees." There was a pause in the recording where the sound of ice clinking in a glass could be heard. Then Liam's voice returned, darker and more predatory. "Once your father transfers that cash, we are set. I will pay off the debts. And then, well, let us just say Tiana is not a long-term investment. She is a stepping stone." Tiana stood frozen at the head table, her hands gripping the edge so hard her knuckles were white. But the recording was not finished. "It is you I want." Jasmine Liam's voice purred, filling every corner of the room. "You are the smart one. You have the assets. Tiana is just the trophy, and frankly, a cheap one at that. We could share the house. We could share everything. Just let me handle Tiana. She is so desperate to get married she will believe anything I tell her." The recording ended with a sharp click. For a second there was absolute silence. Tiana stared at Liam, her eyes wide and unblinking. She looked like a porcelain doll that had been dropped on concrete. Liam sat there, his face a mask of pure terror. He opened his mouth to speak, to offer some spineless excuse like it was out of context or it was a joke. But Tiana did not give him the chance. The scream that tore out of her throat was primal. It was the sound of a woman whose vanity, pride, and heart had been simultaneously incinerated. "You bastard!" she shrieked. She lunged at him across the table, moving with a speed I did not know she possessed. She did not slap him. She attacked him. Her manicured nails, the ones she had spent hundreds of dollars on for the ring photos, raked down his face, leaving bright red streaks. Liam fell backward in his chair, crashing onto the floor with Tiana on top of him. The guests gasped and scrambled away, overturning chairs and spilling drinks. Tiana was a whirlwind of white tulle and rage. She was screaming obscenities, ripping at his tuxedo, trying to hurt him as much as he had humiliated her. My father tried to pull her off, but he was shoved aside by Mrs. Kensington, who was trying to save her son. It was a brawl, a violent, undignified brawl in the middle of the Gold Coast room. I stood on the stage watching the chaos unfold. The waiters were paralyzed. The band had stopped playing. The elite of Chicago were watching the bride beat the groom while the parents screamed at each other over foreclosure notices. It was the most honest moment this family had ever experienced. I reached over and unplugged the USB drive, putting it back into my clutch. My work here was done. I had not just stopped a wedding. I had performed an exorcism. I walked down the stairs of the stage, my red dress flowing behind me like a victory flag. I walked past the pile of fighting bodies, past the stunned guests, and toward the exit. I did not look back. I did not need to. The sound of their destruction was music enough. The doors to the ballroom burst open with a force that rattled the crystals in the chandeliers. It was not the catering staff bringing dessert. It was 6 uniformed officers from the Chicago Police Department, accompanied by 2 detectives in cheap suits who looked like they had been waiting for this moment all week. The sudden intrusion froze the room. Tiana stopped screaming. Liam stopped trying to crawl away. My father Marcus stopped hyperventilating long enough to look at the doorway with the eyes of a man who knew his time was up. The silence that fell over the room was heavy and final. The party was officially over. The lead detective, a man with a tired face and a badge that caught the light, walked straight toward the pile of tulle and tuxedo on the floor. He did not ask what was going on. He knew. He reached down and hauled Liam to his feet with zero gentleness. "Liam Kensington," he said, his voice flat and bored. "You are under arrest for wire fraud, embezzlement, and grand larceny across 3 states. We have a warrant for your extradition to Nevada." Liam started to sputter, trying to pull his arm away. "Get your hands off me!" he shouted, his voice cracking. "Do you know who my family is? We are the Kensingtons." The detective laughed, a dry, humorless sound. "Yeah, and I am the Queen of England. Turn around." The sound of the handcuffs ratcheting shut was the loudest thing in the room. Then the detective turned his attention to my family. He pulled a folded piece of paper from his jacket pocket. "We are also looking for a Tiana Brooks and a Marcus Brooks," he announced, scanning the terrified faces at the head table. Tiana let out a whimper, backing away until she hit the edge of the stage. "That is me," she whispered, "but I did not do anything. He made me do it." She pointed a shaking finger at Liam, who was currently being read his Miranda rights. The detective shook his head. "Save it for the station, ma'am. We have video evidence of you passing a forged document at a federally insured bank. And we have witness testimony that you, Marcus Brooks, conspired to facilitate the transaction." My father looked at me. For a second, I saw a flicker of the man he used to be, the man who claimed to protect me. But then it vanished, replaced by pure cowardice. "Jasmine, tell them," he pleaded, his hands held out in supplication. "Tell them it was a misunderstanding. You can drop the charges. You are the victim, right? You can tell them it was just a family dispute." I looked at him calmly, sipping the last of my water. "I did not press charges, Dad," I said, my voice steady. "The bank did. Federal fraud is not a family dispute. It is a crime. And I am just a witness." The officers moved in. One of them took Tiana's wrists, pulling them behind her back. She gasped as the cold steel touched her skin. A bride in handcuffs is a tragic sight, but a bride in handcuffs who tried to steal her sister's identity is simply justice. They grabbed my father next. He did not fight. He just slumped, looking old, and defeated, his rented tuxedo bunching up around his shoulders. My mother Vanessa was screaming hysterically, demanding to speak to a manager, as if the police department was a restaurant with bad service, but an officer gently but firmly guided her forward as a person of interest. The procession began. Liam led the way, his head hung low, followed by Tiana weeping openly, and my parents looking like ghosts. The guests parted like the Red Sea, holding up their phones to record the walk of shame. I watched them go. I watched the people who had tormented me, gaslit me, and stolen from me being led away to face the consequences of their own greed. The detective stopped by the stage on his way out. He looked up at me and tipped his head slightly. "We got the drive, Ms. Brooks. Solid evidence. We will be in touch." I nodded. "Thank you, detective." As the door swung shut behind them, leaving me alone in the spotlight, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders that I had been carrying for 20 years. I was finally free. "Wait, detective," I called out just before the group reached the double doors. My voice was not loud, but it carried a weight that halted the procession instantly. The officers paused, looking back at me, probably expecting a moment of mercy or a sudden retraction of my statement. My father Marcus turned his head, his eyes lighting up with a desperate, pathetic hope. He thought I was breaking. He thought I was going to save them at the 11th hour, because that is what I had always done. He thought I was still the dutiful daughter who cleaned up their messes. He did not realize that I was done cleaning. I was taking out the trash. I walked down the steps of the stage, my heels clicking against the marble floor, with the rhythmic precision of a ticking clock. I stopped a few feet away from my parents, looking them up and down with the clinical detachment of a coroner examining a corpse. "There is one last piece of administrative business we need to clear up," I said, my voice smooth and dangerously calm. "You were so busy worrying about Liam's liquidity and Tiana's dowry that you forgot to open your own mail, Dad. You missed the final notice on your own mortgage 3 months ago. The bank classified your house, the one you grew up in, and the one you raised us in, as a non-performing asset. They bundled it into a distressed debt portfolio and sold it off at a blind auction at 9 o'clock this morning." My mother Vanessa looked confused, blinking through her mascara-stained tears. "What are you talking about?" she demanded, her voice wavering with rising panic. "That is our home. We have lived there for 30 years. You cannot touch our home. It is protected." I smiled, a slow, cold expression that did not reach my eyes. I reached into my clutch one last time and pulled out a folded property deed, the ink still fresh from the printer. "Actually, I said, holding the document up for them to see, because I am the one who bought it. I purchased the note for pennies on the dollar through my holding company. It was a steal, really. The market value is decent, but the sentimental value of evicting the people who tried to destroy me is priceless." My father's knees actually buckled. The officer had to grip his arm tighter to keep him upright. He stared at me with pure, unadulterated horror. "You bought our house?" he whispered, his voice barely audible. "You own it." I nodded slowly, enjoying every second of his realization. "I am the new landlord, Dad, and I have a very strict policy against tenants who commit felonies and steal from the owner. So here's the situation. I am serving you with a verbal notice to vacate right now in front of these officers and 300 witnesses. I am generous, so I will give you 24 hours. You have until midnight tomorrow to remove your personal effects." I continued, my tone hard as granite. "Anything left on the premises after that time will be considered abandoned property and will be thrown in a dumpster. I will be changing the locks on Sunday morning. Do not ask for an extension. Do not ask for help. And do not try to take the appliances because I have the inventory list. You cannot do this." Tiana screamed, twisting in the handcuffs, her face a mask of ugly entitlement. Where are we supposed to go? We have nothing. I shrugged, turning my back on them to face the empty stage. I hear the Kensingtons have a lovely guest room, I said over my shoulder, my voice dripping with sarcasm. Oh wait, that is being foreclosed on too. I guess you can all figure it out together. Maybe you can start a support group in a motel. Officers, get them out of my sight. The doors swung open and they were dragged into the night, leaving me standing in the center of the wreckage, the undisputed owner of everything they had ever loved. The silence that followed the police exit did not last long. It was replaced almost instantly by the frantic buzzing of a scandal going viral in real time. I stood in the center of the Gold Coast room, watching the exodus of the Chicago elite. They were not leaving with the dignified silence of friends mourning a tragedy. They were fleeing like rats from a sinking ship, scuttling over the spilled champagne and broken glass to get to their cars. But they were not just leaving, they were broadcasting. I saw at least 20 phones held high, glowing in the dim light. The influencers who Tiana had begged to attend were now her executioners. They were live streaming the wreckage to thousands of followers, narrating the downfall of the Kensington and Brooks alliance with breathless excitement. I heard snippets of their commentary as they rushed past me, giving me a wide berth, as if my truth was contagious. You guys will not believe what just happened, one woman whispered into her phone, her ring light reflecting in her eyes. The bride got arrested. The groom is a con artist. And the sister just dropped the receipts on a projector. #wedding from hell. Another guest, a man my father had spent months trying to impress, was typing furiously on Twitter, likely disavowing any connection to the fraudulent investment scheme he had almost bought into. The reputation my parents had spent 30 years building on a foundation of lies was being dismantled in 30 seconds by the very people they idolized. I walked over to the head table, which was now a landscape of ruin. The wedding cake, a 6-tier monstrosity that cost more than my first car, was still standing, but it looked grotesque now, a monument to excess in a room filled with debt. I picked up the bottle of Chateau Petrus my father had ordered. It was still half full. I poured the dark red liquid into my glass, watching it swirl. It was a vintage that retailed for $5,000 a bottle. My father had ordered it thinking he was celebrating a windfall. Instead, he had bought it for me. I took a sip. It tasted like blackberries oak, an absolute victory. The young waiter from earlier, the one who had offered me a free drink when I was exiled to the kids' table, appeared at my elbow. He looked shell-shocked, holding a tray of dirty glasses. He looked at the empty room, then at me, standing calm and composed in my red dress. "Is there anything else I can get you, ma'am?" he asked, his voice filled with a new kind of respect. I looked at him and smiled, genuine and warm. "No, thank you," I said. "I think I have had enough. Actually, I think I have had everything." I reached into my purse and pulled out my black Amex card. The heavy metal clinked against the tablecloth. "Put the entire reception on this," I told him. "The food, the venue, the damages, all of it." He looked at me with wide eyes. "But ma'am, that will be tens of thousands of dollars." I nodded, taking another sip of the wine. "I know. But I want the receipt. I want a record that I paid for their destruction. I want to own this moment completely. Besides, I can afford it. My credit score is excellent." I finished the wine in one long, satisfying swallow and set the crystal goblet down on the stained tablecloth. The room was empty now, save for the staff who were beginning to sweep up the debris of the brawl. The projection screen was still down, glowing with the blue light of the idle computer. The show was over. The actors had been carted off to booking. The audience had gone home to edit their footage. And the director was the only one left standing. I gathered my shawl and walked toward the exit. The air outside would be cold, but for the first time in my life it would be clean. I walked out of the Drake Hotel not as the sister or the daughter or the victim, I walked out as Jasmine Brooks, the woman who burned it all down to save herself. The smell of stale cooking oil and damp plaster hit Tiana, the face the moment she unlocked the peeling door of apartment 4B. It was a sensory assault she had yet to get used to, even after 90 days of this suffocating reality. She stepped inside, kicking off her cheap waterlogged sneakers. Her feet throbbed in a rhythm that matched the dull ache behind her eyes. She dropped her bag onto the stained linoleum floor and looked at her hands. They were unrecognizable. The hands that had once known only the touch of silk designer leather and gel manicures were now red raw and peeling. The harsh industrial detergents she used for 10 hours a day at the diner had eaten away at her skin, leaving behind a map of cracks and blisters. She was 25 years old, but her hands looked like they belonged to a woman 3 times her age, who had known nothing but hard labor. In the corner of the single cramped room that served as a living area dining room and her parents' bedroom, her father sat slumped in a second-hand armchair that smelled of dust. He looked 10 years older than he had just 3 months ago. His hair, once dyed a rich chestnut to hide the gray, was now a patch of white and thinning roots. His shoulders, usually squared with the arrogance of a man who believed he owned the world, were curved inward, as if he were trying to make himself smaller to disappear entirely from this humiliating existence. He didn't even look up when Tiana entered. He just stared blankly at the wall, a man hollowed out by the loss of his status. Her mother was by the kitchenette trying to coax life out of a hot plate that had seen better days. She turned as the door clicked shut, her face a mask of weary desperation. Her eyes darted to Tiana's hands, then quickly away, a flicker of guilt she refused to acknowledge. They were all trapped in this box together, 3 people who had built their lives on the suffering of another, now suffocating under the weight of their own consequences. Tiana walked to the sink and turned on the tap. Cold water sputtered out. She didn't bother waiting for it to warm up. They couldn't afford the electricity bill anyway. She splashed her face, trying to wash away the grease and the shame of the day. A customer had recognized her today. An old friend from her private high school had come in for a ironic dive bar burger and spotted Tiana scraping leftovers into the trash. The look of pity in the girl's eyes had been worse than any insult. Tiana had fled to the back alley and hyperventilated for 5 minutes before the manager threatened to dock her pay. She dried her face with a rough towel and turned to her parents. The silence in the room was heavy, thick with the unspoken accusation that this was all their fault. If they hadn't stolen from Jasmine, if they hadn't been so greedy, if they hadn't raised Tiana to be a monster, they wouldn't be here. But nobody said it. They needed a lifeline, not the truth. Her mother wiped her hands on a rag and reached into her pocket, pulling out a cracked smartphone. It was the only remnant of their old life they hadn't sold, kept alive only by the free Wi-Fi from the coffee shop downstairs. Her hands trembled slightly. It was the first of the month. Rent was due in 2 days, and Tiana's tips hadn't been enough. They were short, again. Tiana watched her mother navigate the screen with a desperate kind of hope that made Tiana's stomach churn. They had been trying for weeks. Every time the reality of their poverty became too much to bear, her mother would convince herself that enough time had passed. That Jasmine, the daughter she had abused and discarded, would suddenly develop amnesia and a bleeding heart. Her mother pressed the call icon and put the phone on speaker, setting it on the wobbly table as if it were a sacred object. The 3 of them gathered around it, holding their breath. The silence of the room was amplified by the rhythmic, hollow ringing tone. 1 ring, 2 rings, 3 rings. Tiana closed her eyes. She could imagine Jasmine seeing the number. She could picture her sister probably sitting in a sun-drenched office or a beautiful home looking at the screen with indifferent eyes. Jasmine wasn't angry anymore. Tiana knew that. Anger implied attachment. Jasmine was just done. The ringing stopped abruptly. It wasn't a voicemail greeting. It wasn't a pickup. It was a sharp final click followed by the dead hum of a disconnected line. Then a computerized voice broke the silence, cold and indifferent. "The number you are trying to reach has blocked this caller. Please do not try again." The automated message hung in the air, echoing off the thin walls. Her mother let out a sound that was half sob, half gasp, her hand flying to her mouth. Her father finally looked up, his eyes watery and red-rimmed, the hope draining out of him like water from a cracked vessel. Tiana stared at the phone. There was no anger left in her, only a hollow, aching void. She realized then that the punishment wasn't just the poverty. It wasn't the scrubbing of dishes or the cramped apartment. The true punishment was this silence. It was the absolute total erasure from Jasmine's life. They didn't exist to her anymore. They were ghosts haunting a life that had moved on, leaving them behind in the ruin they had created. Her mother began to weep, a low, keening sound of self-pity. Tiana didn't move to comfort her. She looked at her raw, blistered hands and realized this was it. There was no rescue coming. There was no golden parachute. There was only tomorrow and the dishes and the rent and the long, slow fade into nothingness. She turned away from them, walked to the mattress in the corner, and faced the wall, wishing she could sleep and never wake up to this reality again. The morning sun filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the expansive living room, casting long, golden geometric patterns across the polished Italian marble floors. It was a stark, beautiful contrast to the gray shadows of her past. Jasmine sat at the mahogany dining table, the surface cool and smooth beneath her fingertips. Before her lay a stack of crisp documents, the paper heavy and expensive. It was the final acquisition contract for her new design firm's expansion, a deal worth more than the entire stolen trust fund that had once been the center of her family's war. She uncapped her fountain pen, the nib gliding effortlessly across the signature line. The scratch of the ink was the only sound in the house, a quiet testament to the peace she had purchased with her resilience. There was no shouting here, no manipulation, no walking on eggshells waiting for the next emotional blow. Just spacelight and the silence of a life finally under her own control. The chime of the doorbell broke the quiet, melodic and soft. Jasmine didn't flinch. She knew who it was. She stood up, smoothing the front of her linen trousers, and walked to the entryway. When she opened the heavy oak door, Uncle James stood there, a warm smile crinkling the corners of his eyes. He held a bottle of vintage wine in one hand and a housewarming plant in the other. He looked good, healthier than he had in years, as if the toxicity of her parents had been poisoning him too, and their absence was his cure. Jasmine stepped aside to let him in. He whistled low and long as he stepped into the foyer, his eyes taking in the high ceilings and the artfully curated space. He didn't say it, but the pride radiated off him in waves. He set the plant down on a side table and turned to embrace her. It was a solid, grounding hug, the kind that reminded her she wasn't entirely alone in the world. They moved to the terrace overlooking the city skyline. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of the ocean. James poured 2 glasses of wine, the liquid dark and rich in the crystal. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the city move below them like a living organism. James took a sip and looked at her, his expression turning serious, but gentle. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone, glancing at it briefly, before setting it face down on the table. Jasmine knew what he was going to say before he said it. The grapevine in their extended family was thin, but it still existed. He told her he had heard about the phone calls. He knew about the blocked numbers, the desperate attempts from payphones, the silence she had returned to them. Jasmine felt a flicker of old instinct, the urge to justify herself, to explain why she couldn't open that door again. But she stopped herself. She didn't need to explain. Not to him. James leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, catching her gaze and holding it firmly. He saw the flicker of doubt in her eyes, the ghost of the little girl who just wanted her mother to love her. He shook his head slowly, silencing the guilt before it could take root. He told her clearly that she needed to stop looking back. He gestured to the home around them, to the contract on the table inside, to the woman she had become. He spoke with the weight of a man who had watched the entire tragedy unfold from the sidelines, helpless, until she saved herself. Family is not defined by whose DNA you carry, he said, his voice steady and absolute. It is not about bloodlines or birth certificates. Family is respect. It is mutual care. It is safety. Those people gave you none of that. They consumed you until there was almost nothing left. You building this life, you protecting your peace, that is not cruelty. That is survival. You did the right thing, Jasmine. You broke the cycle. Jasmine felt the tension leave her shoulders, a physical weight lifting off her chest. She looked out at the horizon, the sun climbing higher into the sky. She took a sip of wine, the taste sharp and clean. She finally believed him. She was free. The crisp autumn air of Paris swirled around Jasmine, carrying the scent of roasted chestnuts and the faint mineral tang of the Seine. She pulled her trench coat tighter against the breeze, standing on the Pont Alexandre III, with the golden statues gleaming under the twilight sky. Just hours ago, she had finalized a partnership with a leading European textile firm, a deal that would cement her company's status on the international stage. But standing here watching the lights of the Eiffel Tower blink into existence against the darkening horizon, business was the furthest thing from her mind. For the first time in her life, the silence in her head was not filled with calculating how to survive or dreading the next crisis her family would manufacture. It was just silent, peaceful. She turned from the railing and found a small round table outside a brasserie in the Marais, ordering a glass of Sancerre. She opened her sketchbook, the charcoal gliding over the paper as she captured the arch of a doorway across the street. It was a luxury she had never afforded herself before, the simple act of creating art for no purpose other than joy. The perspective is excellent, but you missed the cat sleeping on the ledge. Jasmine looked up. Standing there was a man who possessed a quiet, commanding presence. He wore a charcoal overcoat and a scarf loosely draped around his neck. His eyes crinkled in genuine amusement. He didn't look like the sharks she dealt with in business, nor the parasites she had left behind in her family. He looked solid. I suspect the cat moved before I could do him justice, Jasmine replied, surprising herself with the ease of her banter. Usually her guard was up so high it scraped the clouds. He laughed, a rich, easy sound. I'm Liam. Do you mind if I join you? I hate drinking alone in the most romantic city on earth. Normally Jasmine would have said no. She would have calculated the risk, wondered what he wanted, wondered if he was like the people she used to know who only saw her as a resource. But looking at him, she saw only curiosity and kindness. I'm Jasmine, and sure. They talked for hours. He was an architect based in London, passionate about restoration and history. He didn't ask about her family. He didn't ask about her trauma. He asked about her art, her vision, her favorite places in the world. He listened when she spoke, really listened, not just waiting for his turn to speak. There was no transaction here, only connection. As the night deepened and the waiter brought the check which Liam insisted on paying, without a hint of expectation or power play, Jasmine felt a profound shift deep within her bones. She looked at this stranger who treated her with immediate, effortless respect, and then she thought of the cramped apartment back in the States where her parents and Tiana were likely stewing in their own misery. The invisible tether that she had feared would always pull her back to their level finally snapped. It didn't break with a bang, but with a whisper. She realized she was not just geographically distant from them, she was spiritually untethered. Their poverty, their anger, their desperate phone calls, none of it could touch her here. She was whole, she was successful, and for the first time she was open to a future that was entirely beautifully her own. Would you like to take a walk? Liam asked, offering his hand. Jasmine looked at his hand, then up at his eyes. She smiled, a true, unburdened smile that reached all the way to her soul. I would love to. She took his hand and they walked into the Parisian night, leaving the ghosts of her past on the other side of the ocean where they belonged. The soft golden haze of the Parisian memory dissolves, replaced by the crisp, high-definition reality of the penthouse suite. The city lights of New York sprawl out behind the floor-to-ceiling glass, a galaxy of diamonds that Jasmine now owns a piece of. She sits in a velvet armchair, the fabric deep emerald green, looking every inch the architect of her own destiny. There is no trace of the trembling girl who once begged for scraps of affection. There is only the woman who forged herself in the fire of betrayal and came out unburnable. She sets her wine glass down on the marble side table, the crystal making a sharp, deliberate sound in the quiet room. She leans forward slightly, her gaze locking onto the camera lens with an intensity that pierces through the screen. It is an intimate look, a conspiracy between her and the viewer. She has laid it all bare: the pain, the manipulation, the meticulous planning, and the ultimate satisfying execution of justice. The story is told. The ledger is balanced. She smooths a non-existent crease on her silk blouse, a reflex of perfectionism that she now controls rather than suffers from. She thinks about the question people always ask, the one hanging in the air. Was it worth it? The isolation, the legal battles, the hardening of her heart. She thinks of Tiana's blistered hands and her parents' silent phone. Then she thinks of the peace in her chest, the weightlessness of her mornings, and the man waiting for her in the other room. Yes, it was worth every single second. She knows that somewhere out there, someone is watching this with tears in their eyes, feeling the walls of a toxic family closing in on them. Someone is being told they are crazy, that they are ungrateful, that they are imagining the abuse. Someone is drowning in gaslighting, believing that they owe their abusers their life just because they share blood. Jasmine's expression softens just a fraction, offering a lifeline to that invisible viewer. She wants them to know that the cage is not locked. The door opens. But you have to be the one to turn the handle. You have to be willing to walk through the fire to get to the other side. She tilts her head, a small, knowing smile playing on her lips. It is the smile of someone who knows where the bodies are buried because she dug the graves herself, legally and metaphorically. She raises a manicured finger, emphasizing her final point, the golden rule of her survival. Don't ever let anyone tell you you're not worthy, she says, her voice low and resonant, carrying the weight of a final verdict. Your value is not a negotiation. It is a fact. And if they try to erase you, if they try to rewrite history, to make themselves the heroes and you the villain, you be ready. She pauses, letting the silence stretch, ensuring the next words are burned into the listener's mind. And remember, she adds, her eyes gleaming with a mix of mischief and iron resolve, keep your receipts for everything. You never know when you'll need them. She holds the gaze for a beat longer, then offers a slow, deliberate wink. It is the seal on the contract, the period at the end of the sentence. Jasmine's story serves as a powerful reminder that true family is built on mutual respect and safety, not merely shared DNA. Her journey teaches us that walking away from toxic relationships is an act of self-preservation, not cruelty. We learn that our worth is not defined by those who fail to value us, and that silence often empowers abusers while truth disarms them. Furthermore, Jasmine's strategic preparation highlights the practical importance of keeping receipts, protecting your future by documenting your reality. Ultimately, the greatest victory is not just winning the war, but finding the peace to build a life where your past can no longer hurt you. If Jasmine's resilience inspired you to stand up for your own worth, please hit the like button. Subscribe to the channel and share your thoughts in the comments below.